Hello everyone, DonTheCrown here. Now we have the upcoming Season 5 with all of the new uniques and a whole bunch of aspects kind of getting reworked. But one of the big questions was, where are the new uniques that they're adding for Season 5? And they finally added them to the patch notes. Now, some of these have been really contemptuous because things like Crown of Lucian, for example, was so incredibly strong in the PTR. Pretty much every single build was slapping it on it. So we're going to see what all the changes are. And so I have all of the what they were before pulled up here on Wowhead. They have a nice database with all of the information for all of the items. It's really great. And then we also have on the left side the patch notes. So let's just go through it real quick. So starting off with Crown of Lucian, this is definitely the probably the most contemptuous unique that we were going to get this particular season. And we can see that we're going to keep maximum life, we're keeping lucky hit, but then we are losing core skills and maximum resource, getting shadow resist, which is kind of a filler stat, and cooldown reduction, which is, I guess, okay. And the power has also changed. So previously, this had 75% resource cost reduction, just baseline on it. That's gone completely. That's gone altogether. And then each time you use a skill with a resource cost, gain up to 15% damage, which is down from 25%. And resource cost is increased by 30% for 4 seconds, stacking up to 5 times. So this means you're going to get up to 150% resource cost increase. And I believe 15 times 5 is 75% more damage. So this is a pretty big, sizable nerf here. It was like 125%. So it's like 50% multiplier off there. Also, the amount of cost is going up as well. So it's like 125%, and now it is 150%. And it doesn't have this baseline resource cost reduction just on it. Basically, if you combined this with Starless Skies, they just canceled each other out and just gave you tons and tons of damage. And so I think Crown of Lucian's kind of gone from being ultra super ridiculous to probably only usable in builds that just have a absolute glut of resources, or are somehow doing damage with other skills that are not really burning resources all that much. We'll have to see how this goes. I don't really know if how viable this is going to be anymore. However, that is a really big multiplier with 75% multiplier on a hat that you can potentially keep up all of the time. So it's very likely that these are still going to be a very desirable unique. Next up, we have Endurant Faith. This is keeping its all stats. It's picking up max life, which is really, really good for pretty much every single build in the game. It's also picking up cooldown reduction on gloves, which is great. But then you have healing received remaining, which is not so good. And we're losing core skills. We're losing lucky hit chance. And then they did buff the power, I think, here a little bit. No, the power is the same. So when you be damaged for at least 40% of your maximum life at once, it is instead distributed for the next 4 seconds and reduced by 30%. So this will really help with one shots, kind of keep you from getting blasted in the pit, or maybe like Uber Lilith. However, losing an offensive aspect to pick up a kind of a defensive aspect is maybe not all that great. So I could see this being useful in very some limited situations, but probably not in the majority of builds. Next up, we have the Shard of Verathiel, which is a one-handed sword that was also super contemptuous. It was basically Lucian, this, and then Lorcan's amulet that were kind of hot topics here. And they've changed this around quite a little bit. And so it looks like they're replacing maybe the crit damage with just raw 50% damage. The all stats are staying. The maximum resource is staying. The basic attack speed is also staying. And so is the basic skill. So they're keeping basically all of the things here. But then the power itself is kind of getting toned down. So previously it was 100% to 300% extra damage on basic skills, but they cost 25 resource. That's being dialed down to 50 to 200%. I still think that this is an incredibly strong option for many, many builds. A lot of basic attack builds are going to be using this. Barbarian. Remember that Sorcs can now use swords with this particular season. And so I could see a Arclash build, or even a Firebolt build wanting to use this one-hander. Is going to be a very popular unique still, even with these nerfs. I think these are probably a good dial back, and we'll see how it goes. Next up, we have Rakanoth's Wake. These are some awesome pair of boots that I personally didn't get to mess around with in the beta test because it just never dropped for me. But it looks like they're keeping their movement speed, they're keeping their non-physical damage, they're keeping their resistance to all elements, and the cooldowns. They're keeping all of the base stats, and these are just really, really, really good stats. But when you cast a skill on a cooldown, you deal fire damage. They didn't really tell us here if this number is changing, but the general feel about these boots is that they might be a little bit over-tuned, simply because there's a lot of builds out there that can spam cooldowns pretty regularly. It has the attacks reduce the evades cooldown, has a ton of non-physical damage, which is like very powerful for pretty much everybody but Barbarian or maybe Earth Druids. And then, or I guess some rogue builds as well. And then cooldown on boots is insane. All of that resistance is insane. And it's just a pretty obviously good option here. I think this is going to be another very, very popular, very powerful unique with this season. Next up, we have Lochran's Talisman. And this one also was very contemptuous because it just has so many good stats on it and such like a good just like baseline of everything that it kind of just fits in almost any build that would want crit or crit damage. So we're keeping the same implicit on this. It is losing attack speed, and it's keeping its all stats and maximum resource. It's keeping its critical strike damage going all the way up to 115% critical strike damage. But that attack speed is getting changed into all res, which is not really a desirable stat on Amulet. It's a pretty good spot for damage, and so we're not getting that anymore. And then the critical strike chance you get per point of primary resource is going down, so you're only going to be able to get up to 40% crit, which is still incredibly, incredibly powerful. And then each point of primary resource above 100 grants 0.2% multiplicative critical strike damage instead, which I think might be a buff, depending on how this works, basically. So previously it said each point of primary resource above 100 grants 1% additive critical strike damage instead. And so now this thing would kind of work really well, probably with things like the Grandfather to like multiply your critical damage even more. I can see this being very, very popular still, a very, very solid pickup. Now, from this point, it's going to go into all of the aspects. And what we're going to do is I'm going to skip ahead and we're going to go through all of the legendary, all the uniques basically for the different classes, and then we'll backtrack and we'll do the aspects here. So next up, we have the Unbroken Chain Amulet. This is the new Maelstrom Amulet, and it's keeping the same resistances. It picks up the same movement speed, same ultimate damage. We're picking up cooldown reduction, like a large amount of cooldown reduction. And so we're losing Steel Grasp cooldown reduction, but it's getting turned into just generic cooldown, which makes a lot of sense because this whole thing was about casting Steel Grasp to make Iron Maelstrom come back faster. So it didn't make sense that it only had Steel Grasp cooldown instead of just Maelstrom as well. So that is a very nice change. And it appears that the legendary power itself is staying about the same. Now, personally, I don't really think that this is going to be overly viable, mostly because ultimates have kind of been really bad in Diablo 4. There's not really a lot of call to use them at any point. And so I'm hoping to be proven wrong here. And I'd love to see some builds where people are just absolutely tearing it up with this particular amulet, but I don't believe that this one is going to cut it. Speaking of things that will cut, though, the third blade here is a weapon that pretty much turns your weapon mastery skills into core skills. The power here is staying, I believe, exactly the same, but the aspects of the stats at the top here are changing. So we're getting more close damage instead of critical strike damage. The strength on this is going like double, which is really, really good. That is a multiplier for damage. The Fury on kill, the vulnerable damage, and weapon mastery damage is all staying the same. So this sword got a little bit of a buff. I'm not really sure what skill you want to use this with. This might be the type of thing where you kind of combine it with the Unbroken Chain, so you can just spam Steel Grasp as a core skill to do damage. But I'm not even sure that Steel Grasp will really do a ton of damage in the first place. But who knows? Maybe like Iron Maelstrom, third blade combination will be really, really fun to do. Next up, moving on to the Druids, the Basilisk Staff. So this pretty much has when you hit an enemy with an Earth skill, petrify them for 3 seconds. And then petrifying an enemy additionally does a whole boatload of physical damage here. This is actually quite a bit of damage. I'm not sure like how this is actually going to scale, but there's a potential that this could be pretty darn big. For the affixes on this, we can see damage to crowd controlled enemies is getting a big buff there. Earth attack speed is staying the same. Critical strike damage is going up by a lot. Previously it was critical strike damage against stunned enemies. Now it's just everything. So this is less damage on Tuesdays. It's giving 70% more critical strike damage. It's getting more physical damage. And then, oh, never mind. The critical strike chance is still damage on Tuesdays. It's against stunned enemies. We're losing damage to crowd controlled and getting critical strike damage instead, which I guess is kind of okay. Next up, we have Mjolnir Ring. So this is something that actually was not in the beta in its current form. This previously was Bjornfang's Tusks, which was a glove. The problem is that there is another glove for lightning druids, and so they didn't really kind of want to compete with, you know, figuring out which glove you want to do. So now they've changed it to be a ring, so you'll be able to use both at the exact same time. And as we can see here, we're getting like res, shadow res. It's picking up a ton of willpower. Willpower is a multiplier for damage. It's keeping that critical strike chance. You're actually getting movement speed now while Cataclysm is active. So you're going to be moving and a scooting even faster on your Druid. And you're going to get +2 ranks to Endless Tempest on Druid. And I believe the aspect here also is staying the same. So while Cataclysm active, you gain unlimited spirit and deal 100% increased damage. I think there's going to be some really cool Cataclysm builds coming out for the Druid this particular season. Looking forward to seeing those as well. Next up for Necromancer, we have the Mortarcrux. So the Mortarcrux is a new dagger here, and it is changed from close damage to damage. We're picking up a lot of intelligence. So it's going from percentage intelligence, which I think is kind of, I'm not sure if it's a really great stat, to just flat intelligence. You're picking up critical strike damage and vulnerable damage, which is, I think, a lot better than chance to make enemies vulnerable or macabre damage here. These would be much more specific to being able to get them all the time. And they get ranks of Hued Flesh. And then I believe that the power here is also staying the same. So when consuming a corpse, there's a chance to also create a decaying skeletal simulacrum that seeks enemies but cannot attack. And then when it dies, it just explodes and deals a whole bunch of damage, which could be kind of interesting, especially if you're just spam consuming corpses. Be able to pop out tons of these little simulacrums killing things. Next up, we have the Path of Tragul. These are a pair of boots here that give you maximum evade charges for the top, and their power is Bone Prison traps a larger area and fires up to 30 bone splinters at the enemies trapped within. Increase your maximum essence by 2 for 10 seconds each time these bone splinters hit an enemy, so the power is staying the same. It has the same amount of movement speed, the same bone skills, the same armor, and then I believe Bone Prison cooldown is also staying the same. So I think this is probably one of the first legend or first uniques that we're seeing that hasn't been changed going from the PTR into current. And I believe that they did fix this so that the Bone Prison itself, I believe if it's made too big, it wasn't like hitting enemies inside of it, and they did bug fix that. Next up, moving down to the Rogue, they have the Umbercrux. So the Umbercrux is a unique dagger where your subterfuge skills create an attackable shade totem for 8 seconds. Any damage it takes is replicated onto surrounding enemies at 20% effectiveness. So this is about a 33% nerf from what they had before. And also, it previously had 2 shade totems active at a time, and that's been cut down to just 1. So this dagger might be dead on arrival. I know that it was having some problems though in the PTR, where if you had 2 of these totems next to each other, they were just like bouncing the damage off of each other infinitely and just annihilating stuff. So it's possible that they changed that to prevent that from happening. We'll see how that works out. I'm not necessarily sure how good this is going to be anymore compared to what it was like before. Damage here has been changed from close damage to generic. Same amount of dexterity, same amount of vulnerable damage. The subterfuge cooldown reduction is just about the same as well, and innervation is same as well. So besides the legendary or the a unique ability power here being nerfed it is the same thing we had in the PTR, just definitely a little bit weaker. Next up, Shroud of Condurus. This one is something that a lot of people I think were really popping off with. What this does is casting Dark Shroud makes you immune for 2 seconds. This is a nerf from 3 seconds, but your evade cooldown is increased by up to 3 seconds. Evading while Dark Shroud is active leaves behind an explosion that deals a whole bunch of shadow damage and pulls in enemies. So a little bit of a nerf for the immunity time period here. And then evade grants you movement speed is the same. Non-physical is the same. Ranks of Dark Shroud is the same. And it has a whole lot less shadow resistance on here. This is still pretty much going to cap your entire shadow res just based off this one piece for the most part, especially if you get this in a GA. So yeah, I don't really know how I feel about like there being so many uniques that have so much resistance on them now. It kind of makes some resistances just feel super duper easy for super builds, for some builds. And depending on how you path through your Paragon tree, you might just have like 200% resistance on some of these things. So I'm not sure how to feel about that. Next up, we have the Sorcerer. So Sorcerer had these actual conduit pants, which combined with the Crown of Lucion was creating a lot of issues where people were hitting for like the entire server worth of damage basically on things. So I believe that these have been patched up and have been fixed, but we'll see how it goes. So first off, it has, let's read this part. Lightning chain alternates between orbiting you and seeking up to 3 enemies. That's the same. When it returns, it drains 6 mana from you for each active chain lightning. After draining 66 total mana, it explodes and expires if you don't have enough mana for the drain. So the power has remained the same, but I'm seeing some changes in the affixes. So we had, I believe, up to 17% chance for chain lightning to be cast twice. That goes up to 22%. I'm not sure that this is really a good line for this particular build. Yes, you normally would think that you would want to get this to 100%, but since this particular unique wants you to kind of manage how many chain lightnings you're going at any time, otherwise you run out of mana, that could possibly just be a negative if you're accidentally overcasting too many chain lightnings, and it's kind of just a weird setup for me. Next up, the damage reduction got buffed from 5% up to 15%, which is really cool. And then this line here is brand new that we've never seen on anything before. So we have resource generation and maximum. So up to 32% resource generation and a maximum. That could give you a lot of mana, especially because just like on a GA one of these, if we times by 1.5, you can see we get up to 50% more mana. And that could definitely just get like masterworked up to the moon. Be really, really nice. Ranks of chain lightning remain the same here, which I think is a good thing to have for the particular build. And the last unique, which I did a video about how broken this thing is in the bad way. It doesn't really work the way you would expect. So hopefully they went through and patched some of this stuff, but it looks like the power has pretty much remained the same. So casting a core skill additionally fires 2 instances of Firebolt, Frostbolt, or Spark, matching the elements of your last 2 non-core skill casts. And these projectiles deal up to 90% increased damage. And then it is getting lucky hit chance now. It's also picking up flat intelligence as opposed to percentage. It's getting core attack speed, which is a pretty good stat, I think. And then a whole truckload of non-physical damage, which I think is very, very good. So we're losing the damage to crowd controlled, picking up lucky hit, and then getting a bunch of non-physical, which help us hit those Paragon nodes. Probably allow us to path a different way in some parts of the Paragon, so we don't have to get so much non-physical damage on our Paragon. But the reason this thing was completely broken, I did a whole video about this, and I showed it off. What would happen is when you cast a core skill, the 2 instances of Firebolt, Frostbolt, or Spark would inherit the projectile speed of your core skill. And so if you're casting like Chain Lightning, they'd go really, really fast. If you cast like Charged Bolt, they go very slow. And remember that all of the mastery skills are also now core skills. And so if you cast Ball Lightning, the 2 basic skills will like crawl across the screen. But even worse than this is the fact that if a skill didn't have projectile speed, so like Incinerate, Meteor, Flame Wall, Blizzard, all 4 of those skills wouldn't proc a projectile at all. This wouldn't come out, it wouldn't work, nothing would happen. And so hopefully they fixed this and made it a lot better, but we'll have to see how that goes. Now, next we're going to hop back to the top here, and we are going to look at all of the different aspects. I have these pulled up as well, so they made some changes to the aspects as well. And I've already seen one here that I'm going to have to do an entire separate video about, because I think that it is going to be incredibly broken, and I'm not really sure what's going on, like who's doing the math, because it just seems like this stat on it is going to be insane. So it says when an enemy falls below 35% life while afflicted by any of your damage over time effects, an explosion occurs dealing X damage. And then previously it said basically the same, an explosion occurs every 7 seconds. So I think what this means is once they hit 35% life or lower, they explode, doing damage, whereas previously you might have had to wait 7 seconds, or maybe it hit right away and then 7 seconds later it hit again. And so this is maybe like a little bit of a nerf for bosses, but maybe a big buff for actually going out and just doing clear, because if you're playing like Incinerate or something like that, it's like a fireball enchantment, like again a second one, which I think could be pretty cool. Next up is a really popular aspect, is Wild Bolt. So previously it was every 3.5 to 2 seconds. Now it's every half second. Distant enemies are pulled in front of you and electrified, causing them to take 30% bonus damage from all sources for 3 seconds. This effect may occur every 5 seconds per enemies. Wow, this is a huge buff. Absolutely tremendous buff basically to everyone. This is I don't even know how to feel about this. If you remember playing season 2 where every single druid was just vacuuming all of the enemies to them all of the time, this is basically going to be that, but for everyone. Everyone's going to be yoinking all of the enemies to them. This is going to be ludicrous. Every 0.5 seconds, all distant enemies are pulled to you and they take 30% bonus damage for 3 seconds. So you have 2 seconds of downtime with this. This is going to be probably in almost every single build. Now, warning, this can probably also get you killed by dragging enemies to you that you might not want in melee range. So we'll have to see how that works out. Next up, we have Sticker Thought. So Sticker Thought basically gives you thorns while channeling, and 3 seconds afterward. I don't really see any change here. I didn't really know of any builds that were using this. Maybe like some sort of Barbarian, like Spin to Win Thorns build could be interesting. There's not really a lot of channeling skills in the game. I'm thinking like Incinerate maybe. And so, yeah, I'm not really sure how to feel about this one. I feel like channeling is not something that the game really supports all that much. Next up, of Sly Steps. So after losing 20% of your total life, where previously was 50%, you automatically cast a equipped defensive, subterfuge, or macabre skill. This can occur every 5 seconds, but doesn't work on mobility skills. So this kind of makes me wonder how this would work with things like Flame Shield. Would this put this on cooldown? So you pretty much just don't hit your Flame Shield button and let Sly Steps proc it off for you, so that you just take a little bit of damage, props off the Flame Shield, you heal from the Flame Shield, and then it doesn't go on cooldown. Is that how that works? Does this set it on cooldown? Because if it doesn't, that's going to be really, really great. And maybe another way to kind of go like invincible again for this season. We'll have to keep an eye on that one. Next up, we have Dark Dance. So this is kind of a throwback from, I believe, season 2. We had a power like this. Actually, it might have been season 1. I can't remember. Let me know in the comments. But every 5 seconds, while above 60% life, core skills cost extra life instead of primary resource. And skills that spend life deal bonus damage. They deal up to 80% bonus damage. And I think that this has the potential to do an insane amount of damage on certain builds, like looking at Whirlwind, Incinerate, things like that, where you're holding down and channeling. I'm assuming that this would like basically snapshot for you, give you a huge damage bonus for just having it on a ring slot, which is pretty cool. You can put this on an amulet. That's like a lot of damage, like 120% multiplier potentially for those builds. Granted, it's only up every 5 seconds, so you have to like kind of hold your snapshot. Next up is the one that I'm going to be doing an entire video about, and it's Creeping Death. I think that this is probably way overtuned, stupid broken, insane. Every build's going to want to probably use this that is using damage over time, and this particular aspect is probably going to rule the meta this season. So dot damage increased by up to 50% for each different crowd control effect on the target. Now, unstoppable monsters and staggered bosses take 150% bonus dot damage. So that means that if you put this on a two-handed weapon, you get 100% bonus damage for each different crowd control effect on the target. So it's like slows, snares, freezes, stuns. You get the idea, right? That's way more damage than pretty much anything could ever have given us before. This is like probably this is going to go insane. Absolutely just cranking through the roof. And like staggered bosses, like it kind of seems like that is bad, but like having a 300% multiplier if you put it on a two-hander against staggered bosses in a build that is interested in applying a lot of different types of crowd control means that you're going to stagger them really quickly and be able to get that bonus very quick. I think this is just overtuned. They need to like take this back to the shop. Yeah, I'm going to do a whole video about this. Anyways, next up we have Aspect of Prudent Heart. So you become immune to damage for 4 seconds when you lose more than 20% of your life in a single hit. This can only occur every 20 seconds. No real changes here. This just prevents you from getting one shot. I can see this being popular with builds that are trying to like really push the pit and trying to avoid getting one tapped by the boss, but we'll have to see how that works out. Next up, we have the legendary aspects for the Barbarian. So starting off first, we have the Executioner. So if you kill an enemy with an overpower, spawn an earthquake. Cannot occur more than once every 6 seconds. So this got nerfed. Previously, it was every 4 seconds. And there's not really a talk about how long it lasts for. I'm assuming it still lasts for 4 seconds. And so, and it's very like earthquake on Tuesdays type of thing where you have to kill an enemy with an overpower. I'm pretty sure the earthquakes themselves can't overpower. And I don't really like this aspect all that much. It kind of feels a little bit difficult to make work. And I'm not a big fan of that. So Aspect of the Fortress. And although this, like, if maybe you can find some cool puzzle piece stuff to put this together. So as for the Fortress, for every 10% life you're missing, gain 6% damage reduction. This is buffed up from 5%. And so this could be quite a bit of damage reduction, especially if you're like trying to do some sort of like old school damage reduction on a low life type of setup. Because at like 50% of your life gone, that's a 30% DR, which is pretty big. So next up, we have Anger Management. This is one that I've heard a lot about, but while above 40 Fury, you are Berserk, but you lose 4 Fury per second. So you're losing more Fury than you were before. It's kind of a theme that we saw with Ramaldani's Opus, where the Fury cost of using it has gone up. And same thing here with Anger Management. But this is a really great way, if you're generating a lot of Fury in your build automatically, to just be Berserk while you have a lot of resources, which can tend to be like a little bit of a pain in the butt to manage anyways. And Berserk does give you a lot of damage, especially if you're using the key passive for it. And so I think this is probably a pretty good aspect to get. It is unfortunate it's an offensive aspect, so you're kind of losing a little bit of damage there. But having basically guaranteed Berserk does free up a lot of space in your build for other stuff. Next up for Druids, we have Moonrage. So when an enemy is killed, there's a 5% chance a wolf companion will assist you for up to 35 seconds, and you have up to 3 wolves. And I believe this is basically exactly the same, but you also are still getting +3 to wolves, and this is a lucky hit against bosses. So this is the big change here. So previously, this aspect would just turn off against single targets, but now it is a lucky hit. It doesn't tell you what the percentage lucky hit, probably a 5% chance, I guess, which does seem rather low. I would hope that it would be like, this is a lucky hit and it's like 20% or something, but I guess like having the ability to have more wolf companions, especially if you're speccing into wolves, you're gonna be able to bring the whole pack down on some enemies. Next up, we have Rejuvenating Aspect. So when you would drop below 20 spirit, there's a 30% chance for your spirit to be instantly refilled to the max, and that's staying the same. I think this has some interesting connotations to it. We could potentially get some popping off here. It is a ring aspect though. Spirit Bond, so you get up to 35% of the damage you take is instead shared amongst your companions, and they cannot die. This is a huge buff for the survivability of pretty much every single Druid build. This is insane. So pretty much 35% of damage is now just like negated. It goes to your companions and they can't die. This is probably something that like a lot of Druid builds are going to put in. And obviously if you're playing a companion Druid build, you're definitely going to want this to keep your companions alive. And you get 35% DR while you're doing it. And that is a pretty big number. That is like above some uber uniques amount of DR, and very, very nice buff here for Druids. Next up, we have the Necromancer with Shade Mist. So your minions become shadow imbued, dealing shadow damage to nearby enemies over 5 seconds, which I believe is exactly the same. Although it's a little bit different. So per second around them, and then the damage over time lasts after leaving the aura. And so that's all removed. And so now it's just like damage over time thing. That is just constantly, I guess, cooking around them. And I don't know, like it seems like 2%, 2 seconds would probably be better here than 5 seconds. So maybe like the language here is a little bit weird, but I'm not sure how to feel with this one. I think that like having your minions do a ton of shadow damage though could be interesting for some, shadow gameplay. Cursed Aura, so gain an aura that automatically afflicts nearby enemies with Decrepify and Iron Maiden for 4 seconds. In addition, cursed enemies spread their curses to additional enemies every 0.2 seconds. So this basically allows you to curse one thing, and if you're dragging it with you with like a whole bunch of different things, like Wild Bolt or something, you're just going to be able to drag that curse everywhere. Although getting enemies nearby you, you're pretty much just going to curse them automatically. So I'm not necessarily sure that the spreading factor here matters all that much. I can just guess with Wild Bolt, you just pull enemies to you, they're auto cursed, and you just blast them apart. Could be pretty cool. And then lastly, we have Of the Great Feast. So this makes it so that each minion drains essence per second. Up, I think it's like 1 to 2, and then like 1's probably the better here. But deals 125% bonus damage. So it's 25% just more damage. So this is a buff. Then with no minions, this bonus applies to you and drains 5 essence per second. And so you can get that 25% bonus on yourself. This is kind of an insane aspect here for sure. Definitely going to potentially be big damage, but that 5 essence drain you kind of have to deal with there. Lastly, let's go to, next up go to Rogues. So Rogues have damage to inner sight targets will always crit and deal 100% critical strike damage. That is staying the same. And then we have Cold Clip. So your basic skills are always cold imbued, but increased damage to chilled and frozen targets by 35%. So this is getting 15% more damage. So a little bit of a buff here for that, which is good. I don't know why Of True Sight is here twice, but maybe this is a mistype here and they put the wrong thing in here. I'll go report that to the guys over at Blizz. And then lastly, we have some changes to some of the Sorc stuff. So we have Winter Touch aspect. So when you freeze an enemy, you deal cold damage to them. And now it is, I believe, just the same. So when enemies are frozen, they take damage. It's treated as a frost skill. I really don't like this aspect. I think this is probably bad. This is kind of, the problem with it is the fact it doesn't provide any multiplicative damage. It's kind of just like a secondary endpoint. Whereas it'd be way better to even have a 10% damage boost for your primary damage, as opposed to trying to like make something else do damage here, which is, unfortunate. Next up, Jolting. The cooldown on this went down from 1 second to 0.5, and it zaps and does shock damage. Has the exact same problem as Winter Touch though. Like it'd be way better for me to make my Chain Lightning to do more damage than trying to count on jolting to do the damage, unless this is doing an insane amount of damage that allows you to like blasting single target. I don't know how good that is going to be. And then lastly, they changed the wording, I believe, up in this a little bit. So when burning is applied to an enemy that was not previously burning, they take an additional like splash of fire damage. And this counts as pyromancy skill. Once again, I mean, honestly, this is probably even worse than the other two, because most of the time you're playing a burning build, you keep enemies burning. And this will only pop off one time, whereas jolting is going to at least shock 2 times a second. And then winter touch would shock every time they get frozen. But Firestarter is only 1 pop. So I could see maybe using this for leveling if it happened to flop into my hands and I had nothing else. But overall, pretty bad. Let me know what you guys think of all of the different aspects and stuff. I'm going to be trying to cover a whole bunch of the changes here. I'm going to go through a whole bunch of builds for the upcoming season. Very, very excited. I think Season 5 is going to be an absolute hilariously ridiculous, overpowered, so many different build variety type of season, and we're looking forward to see what we put together. Hope you guys have a good one. I'll see you again later.